Welcome everybody to Nature Network.
We're very excited. Our very special guest is Dr. Bryan Fry, Associate Professor with the Toxins Evolution Lab in Queensland, Australia. And tonight we're going to be talking Komodo dragon venom.
Cool.
So Bryan, let's jump right into this because I want to know what the deal is about Komodo dragon venom. And we have always historically thought about this sepsis bacteria in the mouths of these Komodo dragons. And I guess that's just not the case. So if you could explain that for us, that'd be awesome.
With starting with the bacteria side of things, there's a very simple premise in science that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and using bacteria as a weapon is as extraordinary of a claim as you could possibly make. And this all came from a 1979-1980 book by Offenberg, who spent a year on the islands of Komodo and Rincha doing natural history observations. And in his book, early on, he described seeing some water buffalo get infected after being bitten by Komodos. And then that's it. There's nothing else in the book until some throwaway comments towards the end of it about bacteria being used as a weapon, something for which he had no data to support, but it became this enchanting fairy tale. And then it was staged for numerous documentaries where, it's actually a quite rare event. I've seen it happen on the islands, but it's a completely unnatural event. So first off, water buffaloes are only found in a couple of the valleys on the islands. They're not found island-wide, and they're a very recent introduction. They were brought there only a few hundred years ago by Dutch explorers as a food source, and then they left them. Komodos also didn't evolve in the islands. Komodos are actually an Australian monitor lizard. Like the oldest fossils in Australia are millions of years older than the Indonesian fossils. There's nothing special about a Komodo dragon. It's not the biggest to have lived. It's actually only the third biggest. There was a 5 to 5.5 meter one that radiated from Australia out to the islands of Timor, subsequently went extinct. Komodos migrated out through Indonesia into the islands around Flores, subsequently went extinct in the Australian mainland. And then Megalania, which was 7 to 7.5 meters, stayed in Australia and also went extinct, like the other two giants, when the megafauna in Australia went extinct. So these lizards are all basically turbocharged versions of the lace monitor. So like if you see the lace monitors from down south in Australia around Malakuta, where they get the biggest, there's these jet black things that get to about 2 meters long. And males, when they get to about 2 meters, get that big nostril flaring and the head starts broadening, and you can see they're very Komodo-like at that point in time. So you can see the emergence of a Komodo. So from a skull kinetics, morphologically, ecologically, nothing distinguishes the Komodo from, it's just a variation on a theme. So with what's been going on in Indonesia, it is quite, it's exceedingly simple. Water buffalo, when they feel threatened, their instinct is to flee into the water, hence their name. So in Southeast Asian mainland, they flee into these giant marshes. Well, on the islands which they're trapped on by being introduced by man on Rincha and Flores, Rincha and the island of Komodo, the only available water source to them are these stagnant rocky watering holes, and they only share part of the range of Komodo. So there's aspects, so Komodos are living in other parts where there aren't water buffalo, but with these stagnant rocky watering holes that aren't much larger than your backyard pool, there is no vegetation. There's nothing to break down all this water buffalo crap that's accumulating in there. So I remember the first time that we went to the islands, and you can smell these watering holes. I mean, they are putrid. You can smell them hundreds of meters away, because it's as saying they're boiling in the tropical sun. And I remember the first time that we went there, I thought, ooh, I don't want to step in that. I've got a big cut on my leg. And I was like, oh no, it can't be that simple. It's one of these light bulb moments. But that's what it's been all this time, is a fundamental misreading of an artificial encounter between Komodos and water buffaloes, where the water buffaloes have a 100% escape rate from Komodos. A Komodo is not big enough to take down a water buffalo, but a Komodo will opportunistically have a go at anything. They're a big predator. They'll bite anything to see what happens. So they bite a water buffalo, it gets scared, it runs off, follows its instinct straight into the water that is now rancid sewage, and may or may not get infected, but this is the entire simplicity of it. And there has never been a single documented case of the same Komodo that did the biting that resulted in an infection. And not all of them result in an infection, but there's never been a single documented case of that Komodo benefiting from that water buffalo dying of infection, because infection is a very slow process.
Right.
You're talking about a week to 10 days or longer. Like, we observed one water buffalo and it took 11 days to die from an infection. Had a big deep wound and part of its colon hanging out. So it was toast. It was going to get septicemia. But we recorded all the Komodos that were hanging around that watering hole, and the one that did the biting was nowhere near to be seen when the water buffalo ultimately died. So nature does not run a charity. If the animal that inflicts the damage doesn't benefit from it, there's no selection pressure for a particular behavior. And then as far as the idea of Komodos having bacteria in their mouths, this too has been an absolute fairy tale, because if you examine the mouth of your typical Komodo, it's actually cleaner than the mouth of a lion or your average 5-year-old kid who just chomped on his classmate. Right. Komodos actually are fastidiously clean animals. After they're done eating, they will lip lick and rub their heads in the leaves for 10 to 15 minutes and clean themselves up remarkably. So if you look in the mouth of a Komodo, the teeth are going to be shiny and white, and the gums are going to be healthy and pink. You're not going to have rancid, rotting flesh hanging off the teeth, acting as bacteria bait. So, and there's also been this weapons grade cognitive dissonance where on one hand, Komodos are supposed to be incubating super bacteria in their mouth, but on the other hand, they're supposed to be a source of new antibacterial wonder drugs because they can eat rotting flesh, because they can eat carrion. Well, you can't have it both ways. Okay. Either if they're incubating bacteria, then that means that they're not killing bacteria. So with this thing, it's something that absolutely has captured the fascination of the world. And when we published our studies debunking the idea of bacteria, well, first off, in the actual sample collection, we had several zoos participating. Like Honolulu Zoo was awesome. LA Zoo was amazing. They even let us sample baby Komodos as they were hatching from the eggs.
Nice.
And then with what's happening, so if they are incubating bacteria in their mouth, we should see this as a consistent feature even in captive animals. No, their bacteria load is quite low, and whatever bacteria is in there is just transient. It's reflective of whatever they last ate or whatever they last drank. It's just transient bacteria species that come and go. Same thing with the wild dragons. They have transient bacteria, but they're not incubating them. They're not inoculating their prey with them. So when we were going and doing that part of the research, it was bizarre because we had blowback even at that level. We had some zoos that flat out refused to participate in the study, and some of them actually even took it upon themselves to ring other zoos to tell them that we were crackpots and to not participate in the study. They did not want the idea of bacteria and Komodos to be challenged. It was extraordinary. And then when we submitted our results, we had battles with reviewers the likes I've never seen. It took almost a year to get the paper accepted, and none of the reviewers were criticizing the science. It was almost like a religion. Well, in fact, it was a religion. That's the definition of religion, is believing something regardless of what the data says. It's like people who say, well, if the data contradicts the Bible, I'm going with the Bible. Well, in science, which is supposed to be dispassionate and objective, is not. So it took a year to get it accepted, and then the journal sat on it for a year. We had a battle just to get it released for something for which there is no economic value, as opposed to something like climate change, where there's huge economic forces that are threatened by the acceptance of the reality. But in this one, there was no economic issue being threatened, yet many zoos today refuse to change their signs. They still push the Komodo bacteria idea. You go to Rincha Komodos, and the guides there are still pushing this idea, despite there being zero evidence to support it. Now, the real irony is that if you read Offenberg's book, in that book, he describes that they did things that were, of course, thoroughly unethical. They tied live goats to trees, let Komodos tear into them, and then chased the Komodos off just to see what would happen, and then recorded what was going on with the goats. So in the book, they describe the goats being unusually quiet, as if they were sedated, rapidly going into shock, being quiet even with like half their intestines hanging out, bleeding far more than they should from the mechanical damage, and bleeding for longer than would be expected. Right. So all things that we have subsequently confirmed in our research into the venom of shock-inducing toxins are in there, anticoagulants are in there, and we're just about to publish on the first description of neurotoxins from monitor lizard venoms. So Offenberg had one agenda and saw the reality through the prism of that glass. Now, it's the classic aspect of science of be careful what you're looking for, because you may just find it, whether or not it's actually there. So they had a preconceived notion of, trying to support this idea of bacteria, and viewed the world through that prism. But in fact, like I said, inadvertently, that book is the first record of Komodo dragon venom. So it's been one of these ones where it has been, a wild ride about the monitor lizard venom, because, I thought we had gotten a lot of blowback on the bacteria side of things. I had no idea what blowback was until we started publishing about the venom side of things, where there's people today who still insist, that the Heloderma species are the only venomous lizards in the world, even though all the other anguiomorph lizards are putting out identical toxins out of the exact same gland that have the exact same bioactivity. And in the case of the monitor lizards, the venoms are actually diversifying at an extremely accelerated rate, where we see as much difference between different monitor lizard venoms of arboreal versus terrestrial versus semi-aquatic as we do between different lineages of snakes. We're seeing accelerated evolution, which clearly is only going to happen in the presence of a selection pressure. So we've had, like I said, an extraordinary amount of blowback in regards to the venom side of it. And, I've given up trying to convince some of these people. It reminds me of when I did my undergraduate, where I did a triple major of molecular biology, scientific philosophy, and psychology, and did 2 honors theses, one on molecular bio, on contortriostatin as an anti-cancer drug, but then I did another honors thesis marrying up the scientific philosophy and psychology, and that was, how does the mindset of the individual influence scientific revolutions being accepted at sort of a scientific community population level? Because you can't separate the individual from the collective. The collective is merely the voice of many individuals. And my final cynical, but I still think is accurate, conclusion was that scientific revolutions are really only fully accepted when the previous generation die out, because the individual, much, like with the bacteria side of things, we've seen the same mindset with the venom side of it, where they are not changing their view in the face of new data, which is therefore acting more like a religious adherent than like an actual, caricature of a dispassionate scientist.
Mhm. Yeah, I recall when a lot of this first came out and I read your work, and I think that I got blowback for it because I think I was one of the first zoos to change my Komodo dragon graphics to depict that. And I did get a lot of butting heads, and to this day I still do, and I don't quite understand why. And I know I myself could be hard-headed. I still adhere to the old scientific names of stuff I learned as a kid, and I just, well, it changed now, it'll change back eventually, so I'll just wait. But science is science, and that's the way science works. Is you come to realize something that doesn't always mean that it's never going to move. More science, the only thing that can really change science is more science. And so I don't understand the resistance sometimes, outside of being a cultural thing, to not accept some of these scientific findings, such as the Komodo.
It's a good question, because we've published more on this than we have on other lineages that were accepted no problems, like our work on fang blennies, the only fish with a venomous bite, where we showed that they're using it for competitor deterrence, where you have these little fish competing for who gets the perfect piece of coral to hide under. And the fang blennies are injecting their non-venomous competitors with opioid peptides, which is basically getting them stoned. And so they're now no longer having the same anti-predator behavior influence, and they get eaten, therefore removing them from competition. So we've had no problems getting that kind of stuff accepted, no problems on, assassin fly venom, other, venomous lineages. But with the monitors, I think it comes down to two aspects. One is confusing venomous with medically important. A lot of the blowback is very reminiscent of the blowback that I got when we said that all snakes evolved from a venomous ancestor, and that all non-venomous snakes today represent secondary losses. So like an American corn snake, which is for all intents and purposes non-venomous, if you cut it open and look behind the eye and the lip line, you'll find a tiny atrophied version of the venom gland. If you look at the black racer, which is called Coluber constrictor, which is a really stupid name considering it doesn't constrict, it bites the crap out of its prey. They've actually got quite large venom glands. And if you watch them chewing on like an anole or something, you'll see the anole go limp. So they're actively using venom. So when we started publishing that kind of stuff, we got a lot of blowback as well, because people were saying, oh, this, you're going to get these animals banned because of venomous legislation, which is kind of ironic because I'm one of the most proactive scientists of writing letters of support for people who are saying that this legislation is ludicrous, or writing letters of support in regards to, a sane permit system. I've been very vocal against bans, and I've certainly been very open about clarifying that like rear fang snakes, like a hognose snake, should not be included in a venomous ban because they are medically insignificant. They're venomous only from the biological perspective, not from the perspective of human danger, which is what those laws are supposed to be about. Right. Similarly, with monitor lizards, we have never said that they're of human danger. That having been bitten by a number of these lizards and having some of them bleed for hours, I can attest that the real danger is from the very long, sharp teeth, like, having reconstructive surgery on my hand 3 times to put it back together after a large lice monitor absolutely nuked it. Cut the tendon, nerve bundle, and artery in this finger in 2 different places, split the knuckle capsules to the bone on the opposite side, as well as mangling 2 of my other fingers. Took a lot of microsurgery to put it back together. So with the monitors, one aspect is people feeling threatened from a pet trade perspective, but that is irrelevant. Just like all spiders are venomous, but only a handful of them are medically important from a human perspective.
Right.
Similarly, the scorpions, the majority of the scorpions are non-dangerous to humans. It's only the butheid family that has the dangerous ones. So I think that's one aspect, is people feeling threatened. I think another one is simply jealousy, that, here's such an iconic group of animals and it's been staring them in the face all this time. Where if you look at any monitor lizard, you will see a very large gland running the length of the lower jaw. And it's a very advanced gland where it is just as derived and intricate of a structure as is that of a beaded dragon, or a beaded lizard, or a Gila monster.
Right.
So it's, like I said, it's a very refined, clearly defined, intricate structure. So I think it's a combination of, perceived threat to interest combined with, jealousy is, I think, responsible for no small amount of the blowback.
Right. Yeah, it seems to be, as you said, it's something that really was kind of staring us in the face forever. If you look at it logically, I think the first time that I talked to you about it some years ago, everything we talked about, it just made sense. And yeah, it's not being a large predator like that. I mean, what's the sense in having a method of taking down prey that lasts days or a week or something like that? I mean, it just doesn't make sense in that respect. And I do know with some of the dragon venom, correct me if I'm wrong, but they're looking at drugs for making to combat the resistant bacteria, the ones that are resistant to drugs. So you've got, one thing you're saying is it's full of deadly bacteria, but you're trying to pull compounds out of that kill resistant bacteria. So it is kind of to me, kind of a little bit counterintuitive on that.
Yeah, and that's the thing, like with some of the write-ups about where people are talking about these antimicrobials, in the same sentence, they say that they repeat the myth of the dragons cultivating bacteria. It's a cognitive dissonance that is just, astounding to, have two competing thoughts at the exact same time.
Yeah. And I think it goes back to, I think some of the resistance, I think you nailed it right on the head, is that a Komodo dragon is just, for all of us who grew up with reptiles, it is just one of the most iconic, charismatic reptiles out there. And, what we thought we knew about this is now challenged, and our own egos don't want to accept that sometimes. And sometimes you just got to step back. And again, that's what science is all about, is you got to step back and go, you know what, that does make sense. And now I learned even more. And now it's even a cooler animal because my God, it's a big venomous, herp now. How cool can that be? So it, to me, when I first heard about this, I was like, I want to hear more. I want to know more. And I was all about it, man. I mean, they're just a tremendous lizard, and to know that what we originally thought with the Gila monsters and beaded lizards being the only one, again, didn't make a lot of sense. We've got all these different types of venomous snakes, but where do snakes come from? Well, they derive back down from this. So it only makes sense that that we would see this in that class of animals.
Yeah, and when you look at a beaded, they're merely one lineage that has really refined these glands. So if you look, for example, at the sort of the more basal type anguiomorpha lizards, such as the American alligator lizards or Mexican alligator lizards, like in the Abronia genus, they've got one gland for each tooth. And then when you do look at the histology of those glands, they have a lot of drainage channels, and the protein secreting region is very, very large and very, very dense. So they're putting out a lot of material. Like if you let an American alligator lizard chew on something for a while, you'll see it start frothing out material. So they're actually making something as well. So venom is definitely in that group. And then independently on two separate occasions, once in the heloderma, once in the last common ancestor of Lanthanotus and Varanus, that multiple of the ones of those individual glands were fused together, and then the whole structure enlarged. So, which then in both cases you have a splitting off of the mucus versus the protein secreting region, where now the protein secreting region is a discrete gland. The mucous lobules are completely separated to it. And this is analogous to what we see at the base of the advanced snakes, where the protein and mucus secreting regions of those glands were fused into discrete regions. So if you look at the gland of something like a hognose snake, it's got a distinct protein secreting gland here and then mucus in front of it. With the lizards, it's different, where you have on the bottom jaw protein, and then on top of that, you've got mucus lobules, but you've got these ducts from the protein glands threading up through the mucus lobules up at the base of the teeth. So this happened independently between the helodermas and the varanoid lizards. So in both of them, in both cases, the fusing of these smaller glands into a sort of super glands has resulted in a much larger gland, as well as the ability to store considerable amounts of material. So for like example, a big lace monitor can store up to 50 milligrams. A Komodo can store several hundred milligrams at least. And then we calculated that something like Megalania will be storing in liquid form, grams of material. Mm-hmm. And then I think another part of where people are sort of misunderstanding it is that we aren't saying that it's the same sort of thing as snakes, where it's the only game in town. Rather, the venom is there in a supportive role relative to the teeth. So the teeth do the primary damage, the venom potentiates the effects. So, and it's all about leading to prey subjugation. So if you have lower blood pressure, you're dizzy. You're not going to be able to run. You're not going to be able to fight back nearly as effectively. More blood loss means more dizziness, more, because you have lower blood pressure. If you cause low blood pressure by relaxing the like aorta and other big descending arteries, that will also lower blood pressure. So they've got a number of different ways that lower the blood pressure and make the animal vulnerable to repeated attacks. So like in our field observations and that of others, seen that about 70% of the Komodo attacks are successful just from the teeth themselves, where the animals bleed out within about the first 20 minutes. Now, I'm quite happy to call that just purely mechanical damage. But over the next 3 to 4 hours, another 20% bleed out from uncontrollable hemorrhage. And we put that down to the venom side of things because those wounds should have clotted. So this gives it an aggregate kill rate of 90%, which is super predator level. That is a predatory success rate that is one of the highest in the world, if not the highest. That's a higher success rate than a lion. That's a higher success rate than a great white shark. This is true by anyone's measure, super predator level. So we've been talking about that all this time. Yet again, people have not grasped those nuances, but even with the heloderm lizards, people are sort of caught up in a lot of the past with them as well, where there's so much statement that the venom is used just for defense. And the support of that is that when they've cut open, Gila monsters, they found pretty much, like nesting birds in them. Well, those are the Gila monsters they encounter during the month or two of the entire year that they're above ground. And they're above ground then because there's nesting birds. They're eating for the rest of the year. If you throw a live rat to a big beaded lizard, or a live mouse or a small rat to a Gila monster, it's going to bite it. And that mouse is going to die, not from the mechanical wounds, but it's going to die from the venom. People have died from the venoms. And they also have components in their venoms that are incompatible with defensive use. There's powerful neurotoxins, well documented for Heloderma venoms. Mm-hmm. So that's not a defensive function. Pain certainly is a defensive function, but what's causing pain for us is going to be causing a lower blood pressure for a prey animal. And that's from the kallikrein toxins that are cleaving kininogen and releasing bradykinin. In our case, that's going to cause painful local swelling. In a prey animal, though, that's going to act on the blood pressure and drop their blood pressure like a stone. Those same components are present in varanid venom. So if you are happy to call one biochemical secretion with a particular set of activities venoms in one lineage, you have to call it venom in another lineage, or else you're picking and choosing your terms situationally, which does not make any sense.
Yeah. Very cool. Very cool. So are you still working with the Komodo venoms then?
Yeah. So we have a number of papers that we're about to publish on Komodos and other monitor lizards, as well as a variety of Heloderma studies. So looking at new aspects of how they're affecting the blood, as well as I mentioned, we'll be publishing very soon the description of the first neurotoxins from monitor lizard venoms.
So with that venom as an anti-clotting, with the anti-clotting mechanisms with that, the biomedical applications for that could be significant as well. Would you agree?
Oh, certainly. These are chemical compounds that have been honed by millions of years of evolutionary selection pressure. So, venoms already have a very long and rich history in drug design and development. Things like, if anybody taking high blood pressure medication, odds are they're taking captopril or one of its derivatives. Well, that's a medication that was developed a bit over 40 years ago from the venom of South American lance-headed vipers. And despite being a 40-year-old drug, it remains today a $10 billion a year market. This drug from a snake venom has been one of the top 20 drugs of all time. It's up there with aspirin. Its medical and economic importance cannot be overstated. So it's a good illustration of why we need to conserve all of nature, that you can't predict where the next wonder drug is going to come from. And that's why, like when I'm teaching at the university and students ask me, what's the strongest message for conservation? I always say, look, it sounds really cynical, but you can't make an emotional argument, that as you're preaching to the choir, people like me, you're preaching to people like me who already think that way. If you say how wonderful it is to go scuba diving in the parts of the Great Barrier Reef that aren't dying from bleaching because the water's too hot, or the Daintree National Park where it hasn't been cut down, or the Amazon where it hasn't burned, that the only people who are going to appreciate that argument are the ones who are already thinking that way. You're not going to sway someone who fundamentally does not care about nature. Rather, you need to put an economic value on it. You need, the conservation through commercialization angle. Like there's a tree in the Pacific Northwest that was almost completely driven to extinction, is regarded as an absolute trash tree until it was discovered to have a powerful anti-cancer compound in it.
Mm-hmm.
That we've, who knows how many wonder drugs we've already lost by destroying nature. Now that you need to sell nature as a biobank, that any argument that is successful in keeping nature around, to me, is a good argument. That it maybe sounds cynical to people who want to take the purest view of it, but there are no wild places left. There's only the spoiled and the areas that haven't been spoiled yet, but will be if we don't give them an economic reason not to. It's like the whole idea of whale conservation, that the Whaling Commission was actually originally set up, if you look at its original charter, and if you look at the language it's still in there, it was actually set up to manage whales as a resource. It was never set up as a conservation body. So, but eventually it was realized that there was more economic benefit from ecotourism on whales than that there was for them to be dead on the back of a Japanese ship. And that was the only reason that whales were actually not hunted into extinction, was a purely economic one. The emotive side of it didn't sway people. So we need to make those kinds of arguments for all of nature of why we need to keep these animals around, and that includes things, like if you're arguing against Komodo dragons being venomous, you're also arguing against them being a bioresource.
Right, right. Yeah, and that's a great way to make the case. I have often, when I talk to people and educate people, and it's the same thing. It's that it's such an amazing planet, and it's so perfectly balanced. And there are a lot of bad things out there, a lot of natural toxins, a lot of diseases and such, but there's always something out there to balance it. And it's out there in nature, and we just need to find it, but we need to preserve it if we're going to find it, and to take care of that, because the world really is a well-balanced place. Nature is, Mother Nature, I think, is probably the toughest boss you're ever going to find. Everybody's got to have a function, and they've got to do it well. And if they don't, you're out of here. So it's very well balanced. And we just, again, we need to appreciate it for what it is, but also appreciate it for what it can do for us. And it's a selfish way to look at it, but that's the only way to get through to a certain subset of people. What this program is definitely about is taking some of these subjects and bringing them to people in something that they can really understand and go, you know what, that does make sense. I didn't understand it before, but now it makes sense. The Komodo dragon venom, now it makes sense to a lot of people. So that's what this program is definitely all about. And, I want to thank you for being here today, Bryan, because it really means a lot. And, I was thinking, it's like, when is the last time I saw Bryan? And as a matter of fact, the last time I saw you was Houston, but a few days before that, we were actually playing with sea snakes and Komodo dragons as well. So it's just kind of fitting that this is the next time around. Again, for joining us. And, it was great to talk to you. I hope to see you again soon. As soon as all of this stuff blows over, we'll get together and we'll talk venoms and have a good time.
And you have a standing invite to come visit us in Australia anytime.